The notification chimed on Jerome's phone at exactly 11:47 p.m. outside the Grand Millennium Hotel in downtown Chicago. He almost declined the ride request, exhausted after 14 hours behind the wheel, his back aching from the worn driver's seat of his 2018 Honda Civic. But the pickup location caught his attention. The Grand Millennium meant money, and money meant groceries for another week, maybe even enough to fix Lily's bicycle chain that had been broken for 2 months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Jerome pulled up to the circular driveway where valets in crisp uniforms darted between luxury cars like choreographed dancers. The contrast between his modest sedan and the gleaming Bentleys and Mercedes felt stark under the hotel's golden lights. He checked his phone again, confirming the passenger name, Emma Watson. Probably heading home from some corporate event or charity gala, he figured. Another wealthy executive who would sit in silence while typing emails during the 20-minute ride to Lincoln Park or Gold Coast. What he saw emerging from the hotel's revolving doors made him forget every assumption he'd formed. A woman in an elaborate white wedding dress stumbled toward his car, her designer heels clicking frantically against the polished concrete. Even from 30 feet away, Jerome could see the black streaks of mascara painting dark rivers down her cheeks. Her dress, probably worth more than Jerome earned in 6 months, was wrinkled and stained at the hem. She clutched a small beaded purse in one hand while hiking up layers of satin and tulle with the other. Emma yanked open the back door before Jerome could get out to help her, collapsing into the seat with a sob that shook her entire frame. The scent of expensive perfume mixed with alcohol and desperation filled the small car. Jerome adjusted his rearview mirror to get a better look at his passenger, his driver instincts kicking in. Drunk passengers were unpredictable, and crying drunk passengers in wedding dresses were completely uncharted territory. "Where to?" Jerome asked gently, his voice carrying the practiced calm he'd developed during 3 years of navigating Chicago's streets, and the emotional landscapes of strangers who climbed into his back seat. Emma looked up, and Jerome saw something in her green eyes that went beyond ordinary heartbreak. This wasn't just disappointment or wedding day jitters. This was the look of someone whose entire world had collapsed in the span of a single evening. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, smearing more makeup across her face. "Drive," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "Just drive anywhere, I don't care where." Jerome hesitated, his finger hovering over the app's navigation system. Rides without destinations made him nervous, especially late at night with passengers in unpredictable emotional states. His insurance wouldn't cover whatever might happen during an aimless journey through the city, and he couldn't afford any complications that might jeopardize his driving rating or, worse, his ability to work. "Ma'am, I need a destination to start the trip. Company policy." Emma fumbled with her purse, pulling out what looked like a black credit card. Jerome had seen plenty of premium cards during his years driving, but this one was different, heavier, more substantial. The kind of card that suggested the kind of wealth that moved in circles Jerome could only imagine. "I'll pay you $1,000 to drive for 1 hour, she said, holding up the card. "Cash, no questions asked. Just keep driving until I figure out what to do next." Jerome's hands tightened on the steering wheel. $1,000 was more than he typically earned in 2 weeks. It would cover Lily's school supplies for the entire year, maybe even let him take her somewhere special for her 9th birthday next month. But something about the situation felt dangerous, not physically, but in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Look, I understand you're having a rough night, but I can't just drive around without knowing where we're going. If you need to get somewhere specific, I'm happy to help. If you need to talk to someone, maybe I can call someone for you." Emma laughed, but the sound held no humor. It was bitter and sharp like glass breaking. "Call someone? The only person I thought I could trust just destroyed everything I believed about my life 2 hours ago. There's no one left to call." She leaned forward, and Jerome caught sight of her reflection in the side mirror. Despite the makeup streaks and the obvious emotional devastation, he could see she was beautiful in the way that money could enhance natural features. Professional makeup, expensive skincare, the kind of dental work that cost more than most people's cars. But beneath all that polish was something raw and desperate that made Jerome's chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. "What if I offered you more?" Emma's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "What if I offered you enough money to change your life completely? Would you consider just driving then?" Jerome's fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he processed Emma's words. The question hung in the air between them like smoke, dangerous and intoxicating. He found himself staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror, trying to understand what kind of desperation could drive someone to make such an offer to a complete stranger. But Emma's question had touched something deep inside him, a place where his own desperation lived alongside dreams he'd buried under years of survival mode. 3 years ago, Jerome had been a different man entirely. He'd worked as a mechanical engineer for Morrison Industries, one of Chicago's most prestigious manufacturing companies. His days had been filled with blueprints and calculations, solving complex problems that challenged his mind and paid well enough to afford a comfortable life. He'd owned a small house in Naperville with a backyard where Lily could play safely, had a reliable car that didn't require constant repairs, and had even started saving for her college education. The future had seemed bright and predictable, mapped out like the technical drawings he created at work. Then Angela had gotten sick. What started as persistent headaches and fatigue had quickly escalated into something much worse. The diagnosis of early-onset multiple sclerosis had hit their small family like a freight train. Jerome had tried to be strong for both Angela and 5-year-old Lily, juggling 12-hour workdays with doctor appointments, physical therapy sessions, and the increasing demands of caring for a wife whose body was betraying her more each day. The medical bills had started small but grew exponentially as Angela's condition required specialist treatments and experimental medications that their insurance classified as non-essential. Jerome had burned through their savings account first, then their emergency fund. He'd taken out a second mortgage on the house, maxed out credit cards, and even borrowed money from his parents, who were living on fixed retirement incomes. The stress had begun affecting his work performance. He'd missed deadlines, made calculation errors that had never happened before, and found himself unable to concentrate during important meetings. His supervisor had been understanding at first, even sympathetic, but patience had limits in the corporate world. When Angela's condition had deteriorated to the point where she needed round-the-clock care, Jerome had requested family medical leave. The company had granted it, but the unpaid time off had accelerated their financial spiral. Without his salary, they'd fallen behind on mortgage payments, utility bills, and the mountain of medical debt that seemed to grow larger every month. Jerome had spent his days caring for Angela and his nights researching treatment options, clinical trials, anything that might give them hope. Angela had died on a Tuesday morning in November, her hand in Jerome's, as autumn rain streaked the hospital windows. She'd been 31 years old. Lily had been 6. The funeral expenses had consumed what little remained of Jerome's ability to borrow money, and the grief had paralyzed him in ways he hadn't expected. For weeks after the service, he'd sat in their living room, surrounded by sympathy cards and medical bills, unable to process the magnitude of his loss or figure out how to move forward. The foreclosure notice had arrived 3 months later. Jerome had known it was coming but had been powerless to stop it. Losing the house had meant losing the last physical connection to the life he'd built with Angela, but it had also meant escaping the crushing mortgage payments that had become impossible to maintain. He'd sold everything of value, packed their remaining belongings into a small U-Haul truck, and moved with Lily into a 1-bedroom apartment on Chicago's South Side. The neighborhood was rougher than anywhere they'd lived before, but the rent was affordable, and the elementary school was decent enough. Lily had adapted with the resilience that children somehow possessed, making friends with kids whose families also struggled to make ends meet. But Jerome had felt like a failure every day. Watching his daughter eat generic cereal for breakfast because name brands were too expensive, seeing her wear the same 3 outfits to school because new clothes weren't in the budget. Finding work had been harder than Jerome had anticipated. His engineering degree and experience should have opened doors, but the gap in his employment history raised questions he didn't want to answer. Potential employers wanted to know why he'd left Morrison Industries, why he'd been out of work for nearly a year, and why he was willing to accept positions that paid significantly less than his previous salary. Jerome had learned to craft responses that focused on seeking new challenges and work-life balance, but the truth was more complicated and more painful than any interview setting could accommodate. Driving for rideshare companies had started as a temporary solution, a way to earn money while continuing to search for engineering positions. The flexible schedule allowed him to be available when Lily needed him, picking her up from school and helping with homework before starting his evening shifts. But temporary had stretched into months, then years, as Jerome discovered that engineering jobs weren't as abundant as he'd hoped, especially for someone whose skills had grown rusty during his absence from the field. The work was honest, but exhausting. Jerome typically drove from 6 in the evening until 2 in the morning, navigating Chicago's streets and dealing with the full spectrum of humanity that climbed into his back seat. Most passengers were fine, people heading home from work or going out for the evening, but there were also the ones who tested his patience and his safety. Drunk college students who couldn't provide coherent directions, businessmen who treated him like an invisible servant, couples having loud arguments about relationships he didn't want to understand. During the day, Jerome tried to maintain some semblance of normal life for Lily's sake. He attended parent-teacher conferences, helped with school projects, and made sure she had clean clothes and nutritious meals even when money was tight. On weekends, they explored free activities around the city, walking through Lincoln Park Zoo, attending community festivals, or spending afternoons at the public library where Lily could read as many books as she wanted without Jerome worrying about the cost. Lily had inherited her mother's gentle nature, but also Jerome's stubborn determination. She excelled in school despite their circumstances, bringing home report cards filled with excellent grades and teacher comments about her kindness toward other students. She never complained about their small apartment or the fact that they couldn't afford the things her classmates took for granted. Instead, she helped Jerome in small ways, packing his dinner before he left for work, and leaving encouraging notes in his lunchbox that he discovered during breaks, between rides. But Jerome saw how their situation affected her in ways she tried to hide. When other kids talked about family vacations or new toys, Lily would listen quietly and change the subject. When school events required fees or special supplies, she would hesitate before mentioning them, as if she understood the burden each request placed on their tight budget. Those moments broke Jerome's heart more than his own struggles with pride and financial stress. The guilt was constant and heavy. Jerome knew that Angela would have wanted better for their daughter, would have expected him to find a way to provide the stability and opportunities that Lily deserved. But every month felt like a battle to keep their heads above water, and Jerome couldn't see a path that led to anything better. His engineering skills were becoming more outdated with each passing year, and the longer he stayed away from that field, the harder it became to imagine returning to it. Now, sitting in his car outside the Grand Millennium Hotel, listening to a woman in a wedding dress offer him life-changing money, Jerome felt the weight of every choice that had brought him to this moment. The promise of enough money to transform Lily's future was intoxicating, but it came wrapped in circumstances that felt dangerous and unpredictable. Emma's desperation was palpable, her pain raw and immediate in a way that reminded Jerome of his own darkest moments after Angela's death. Whatever had happened to Emma tonight had shattered something fundamental in her life, and Jerome recognized the look in her eyes because he'd seen it in his own mirror during those first terrible months after the funeral. It was the expression of someone who had lost everything they thought they could count on and was now grasping for any lifeline, no matter how unlikely or risky it might be. Jerome turned in his seat to face Emma directly, studying her tear-streaked face in the dim light filtering through the hotel's windows. The desperation in her voice had triggered something protective in him, the same instinct that had made him a devoted father and husband. Despite her wealth and privilege, she seemed as lost and broken as he had felt during those first months after Angela's death. "Before we talk about money," Jerome said quietly, "why don't you tell me what happened? Sometimes it helps to say it out loud to someone who doesn't know the whole story." Emma looked surprised by his response, as if she'd expected him to immediately accept her offer or demand more details about the payment. She wiped her nose with a tissue from her purse, leaving streaks of foundation on the white fabric. For a moment, she seemed younger than her obvious wealth and sophistication suggested, vulnerable in a way that money couldn't protect against. "You really want to know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've got time," Jerome replied, settling back in his driver's seat. "And it sounds like you need someone to listen." Emma took a shaky breath and began to speak. Her story unfolded like a nightmare disguised as a fairy tale. She had met David Rothschild 2 years ago at a charity auction, where her family's foundation was donating a significant sum to children's cancer research. David had been charming and attentive, everything Emma thought she wanted in a partner. He came from old Chicago money, owned a successful investment firm, and moved in the same social circles that Emma had grown up in. Their courtship had been perfect by every measurable standard. Expensive dinners at the city's finest restaurants, weekend trips to Napa Valley and Martha's Vineyard, opera performances and gallery openings where they were photographed for society pages. David had proposed at the Art Institute of Chicago, hiring a string quartet to play while he got down on one knee in front of Monet's water lilies. The engagement ring had cost more than most people's annual salaries. The wedding planning had consumed almost a year of Emma's life. Every detail had been scrutinized and perfected, from the imported French flowers to the custom-designed gown that had required 6 fittings. The guest list included senators, celebrities, and business leaders whose combined net worth could fund small countries. Emma's parents had spared no expense, viewing the wedding as both a celebration and a strategic alliance between 2 prominent families. But 2 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, Emma had overheard a conversation that destroyed everything she thought she knew about her life and her future. She had been looking for David to give him a gift she'd commissioned, a vintage watch engraved with their wedding date, when she'd heard voices coming from his groomsmen's suite. The door had been slightly ajar, and David's voice had carried clearly into the hallway. "The prenup protects most of my assets," David had been saying to his best man, "but even without it, marrying Emma gives me access to the Harrison family trust. Her father's been looking for someone to take over the foundation's investment portfolio, and once I'm family, that becomes a natural transition." Emma had frozen in the hallway, the gift box trembling in her hands as David's words sank in. She'd waited, hoping to hear something that would make sense of what she'd just overheard, something that would explain why her fiancé was discussing their marriage in terms of financial strategy rather than love. "You're really going through with this just for the money?" his best man had asked, and Emma had heard the discomfort in the question. "It's not just about money," David had replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Emma's nice enough and she'll make a suitable wife for someone in my position. But let's be honest, the Harrison Foundation controls over $200 million in assets. Marrying into that family opens doors that would take me decades to access otherwise." The conversation had continued, but Emma had heard enough. She'd stumbled back to her bridal suite, her mind reeling with the implications of David's casual betrayal. Everything about their relationship suddenly made sense in the worst possible way. His interest in her family's business, his suggestions about how the foundation could be more efficiently managed, his insistence on certain clauses in their prenuptial agreement that she'd thought were just his lawyers being thorough. Emma had confronted David directly, bursting into his suite with mascara already running down her cheeks. The scene that followed had been ugly and revealing. David had initially tried to deny what she'd heard, then attempted to convince her that she'd misunderstood his words. When those tactics failed, he'd become angry, accusing her of being naive about how marriages worked in their social circle. "You think your parents married for love?" David had said, his charm evaporating to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. "Your father needed your mother's political connections to expand his business internationally. Your mother needed his money to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown up with. That's how the world works, Emma. Love is a luxury that people like us can't afford." The worst part hadn't been David's mercenary attitude toward their relationship, though that had been devastating enough. The worst part had been the seed of doubt his words had planted about everything Emma thought she knew about love and family. Had her parents' marriage been a business transaction disguised as romance? Had anyone in her life ever valued her for something other than her last name and inheritance? Emma had fled the hotel where the reception was supposed to take place, leaving behind 400 guests, a 5-tier wedding cake, and a future that had revealed itself to be built on lies. She'd spent the last 2 hours walking the streets of downtown Chicago in her wedding dress, ignoring the stares and whispered comments from strangers, trying to process the magnitude of what she'd discovered. "So now I'm sitting in your car," Emma concluded, her voice hoarse from crying and talking. "With nowhere to go and no one to trust, wondering if everyone in my life has been lying to me for years." Jerome sat quietly for a moment, processing Emma's story. He'd encountered plenty of wealthy passengers during his years driving, and most of them had seemed insulated from the kind of raw emotional pain that was currently radiating from his back seat. But Emma's vulnerability was genuine, her hurt as real as anything Jerome had experienced during his own darkest moments. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "That's a terrible way to find out someone's true intentions." "You believe me?" Emma asked, and Jerome could hear the surprise in her voice. "Why wouldn't I believe you?" "Because David will probably tell everyone that I'm unstable, that I imagined the whole thing, or misunderstood some innocent conversation. He has lawyers and connections, and the ability to control the narrative in ways I'm just starting to understand." Jerome turned to look at her again, seeing something in her expression that reminded him of Lily when she'd been bullied at school the previous year. It was the look of someone who had learned that people they trusted could inflict the deepest wounds. "The truth has a way of coming out," Jerome said. "Maybe not immediately, but eventually. What if it doesn't? What if he gets away with it and I just become another cautionary tale about rich girls who couldn't handle reality?" Jerome considered this question carefully. He'd seen plenty of injustice in his own life, situations where people with more money and power had escaped consequences that would have destroyed someone in his position. But he'd also learned that carrying anger and resentment was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick. "You can't control what other people do," he said, "but you can control how you respond. Running away might feel good right now, but it won't solve anything long-term." Emma was quiet for a long moment, and Jerome could see her processing his words. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier than it had been since she'd gotten into his car. "That's why I want to hire you," she said. "Not just for tonight, but for however long it takes me to figure out what comes next. I need someone who isn't connected to my world, someone who won't have ulterior motives or hidden agendas." Jerome felt his pulse quicken as Emma's offer began to take more concrete shape. The money she was discussing wasn't just enough to solve his immediate problems. It was enough to completely transform his and Lily's future. But something about the situation still felt wrong, like accepting charity disguised as employment. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" he said. "Drive me away from here. Help me disappear for a while until I can figure out who I can trust and what I want to do with my life. I have access to accounts that David doesn't know about, money that's entirely mine. I can pay you $1 million to be my driver and bodyguard for the next 6 months." The offer hung in the air between them, impossible to ignore but dangerous to accept. Jerome found himself thinking about Lily, about the opportunities such money could provide for her education and future. But he also thought about the complications that might come with taking money from someone whose life was clearly spiraling out of control. Jerome's phone buzzed with another ride request, but he declined it without looking at the details. The decision surprised him because he'd never turned down potential income before, especially not during peak earning hours on a Saturday night. But something about Emma's situation had captured his attention in a way that transcended his usual focus on fare calculations and efficiency metrics. "Before I give you an answer about your offer," Jerome said, "I need to ask you something. Why me? You could hire professional security, experienced drivers, people with actual credentials for this kind of work. Why trust a stranger you met 20 minutes ago?" Emma shifted in the back seat, adjusting the layers of her wedding dress that had bunched around her legs. The question seemed to catch her off guard, as if she hadn't fully considered the logic behind her impulsive decision. "Because you're the first person tonight who's treated me like a human being instead of a problem to be solved or an asset to be managed," she said. "You listened to my story without judging me or immediately trying to fix everything. You didn't ask about my family's money or start calculating what you could gain from the situation." Jerome understood what she meant. But her reasoning also highlighted how different their worlds were. In Emma's life, apparently, basic human decency was rare enough to be remarkable. In Jerome's experience, most people were just trying to survive their own challenges and didn't have the luxury of ulterior motives beyond paying rent and feeding their families. "There's something else," Emma continued, her voice growing quieter. "When I was walking around downtown after leaving the hotel, I heard people talking about me. Strangers with their phones out, taking pictures, posting on social media about the crazy bride wandering Michigan Avenue. But when I got in your car, you didn't recognize me. You didn't know about my family or the wedding or any of the drama. For the first time in my life, I was just another passenger. The admission revealed more about Emma's isolation than she probably realized. Jerome tried to imagine living in a world where anonymity was a rare gift rather than a given, where every public appearance was scrutinized and documented. His own invisibility, which sometimes felt like a burden, suddenly seemed like a form of freedom that Emma had never experienced. "I still don't understand why you want to disappear," Jerome said. "You found out your fiancé was using you, which is terrible, but it's not like you committed a crime. You could go home, call off the wedding officially, and move on with your life." Emma laughed, but the sound held no humor. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" "Should I? My father is Richard Harrison. Harrison Industries, Harrison Foundation, Harrison Financial Group. The wedding that just imploded was supposed to be covered by 3 different magazines and a documentary crew. By tomorrow morning, every gossip blog and society page in the country will be analyzing what happened tonight." Jerome had heard of Harrison Industries, though he couldn't recall specific details. The name was associated with Chicago business success in the same vague way that most working-class people recognized wealthy family names without really understanding what they did or how they'd acquired their fortunes. "The story won't just be about a canceled wedding," Emma continued. "It'll be about whether I'm mentally stable enough to eventually inherit control of the family businesses. David's lawyers will probably suggest that I had some kind of breakdown, that I'm not competent to manage my own affairs, let alone billions of dollars in assets." The stakes Emma was describing began to make more sense to Jerome. This wasn't just about personal heartbreak or social embarrassment. Her entire future, and apparently the future of thousands of employees and charitable recipients, could be affected by how the next few weeks played out. "What if we made a deal?" Jerome said, surprising himself with the words as they came out of his mouth. "I'll help you, but not for $1 million. That's too much money for what you're really asking me to do." Emma leaned forward, her expression shifting from desperation to curiosity. "What are you proposing? Give me enough to cover my expenses and lost income while I'm helping you. Maybe $50,000 total, paid in installments so neither of us gets in over our heads. In exchange, I'll drive you wherever you need to go and help you figure out your next steps." "Why would you negotiate down from $1 million?" Emma asked, genuine confusion in her voice. Jerome considered how to explain his reasoning without sounding self-righteous or naive. The truth was that accepting life-changing money from someone in crisis felt wrong to him, like taking advantage of Emma's vulnerability, even if she was offering it willingly. "Because taking $1 million from you would make me dependent on your problems," he said. "If something goes wrong, if you change your mind or your family comes looking for you, I'd be in too deep to walk away. $50,000 is enough to help my daughter and me without changing who we are." Emma stared at him for a long moment, and Jerome could see her processing his logic. In her world, apparently, people didn't voluntarily accept less money than they were offered. "You mentioned a daughter," she said. "How old is she?" 8. "Her name is Lily." "What happened to her mother?" The question was personal, but Emma had shared her own painful story, and Jerome felt obligated to reciprocate with honesty. "My wife died of multiple sclerosis 3 years ago. The medical bills and time off work for caregiving destroyed our finances. That's how I ended up driving for Uber instead of working as an engineer." Emma's expression softened, and Jerome saw recognition in her eyes. Both of them had experienced the way life could change direction without warning, how circumstances beyond their control could reshape everything they thought they knew about their futures. "I'm sorry," she said. "That must have been incredibly difficult." "It was, but Lily and I survived it and we're okay now. Different than we used to be, but okay." "Is that why you don't want the $1 million? Because you're afraid it would change your relationship with your daughter?" Jerome hadn't consciously thought about it in those terms, but Emma's question forced him to examine his motivations more deeply. There was truth in what she'd suggested. He and Lily had built their lives around each other and around making the best of limited resources. Sudden wealth would introduce complications and temptations that Jerome wasn't sure he was equipped to handle. "Partly," he admitted, "but mostly because I don't think money solves the kind of problem you're dealing with. You need time and space to figure out who you can trust and what you want your life to look like. Those things can't be bought." Emma was quiet for several minutes, and Jerome could see her weighing his proposal against whatever plans she'd been forming during her hours of walking around downtown Chicago. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said. $50,000. And you help me disappear for a while. But I have conditions. Such as? First, I need you to understand that this isn't just about avoiding embarrassment or media attention. David has connections throughout Chicago's business and legal communities. If he decides I'm a threat to his reputation or his plans, he has the resources to make my life very difficult. Jerome felt a chill at the implications of Emma's warning. He'd assumed they were dealing with a messy breakup between wealthy people, not a situation that might involve actual danger. What kind of difficult? Legal challenges to my competency, frozen assets, restricted access to my own money. David's family has been playing these games for generations. They know how to use the system to protect their interests. And you think disappearing will help with that? I think it'll buy me time to get my own legal representation and figure out how to protect myself. But I need someone I can trust to help me stay hidden while I do that. Jerome realized that Emma's offer was more complicated than he'd initially understood. She wasn't just asking him to be a driver. She was asking him to become complicit in a strategy that might put both of them at risk. "What's the second condition?" he asked. "If we do this, you can't tell anyone where I am or what I'm doing. Not your family, not your friends, not anyone. The fewer people who know, the safer we'll both be." The requirement would mean lying to Lily about why he'd be away more than usual, something Jerome had never done before. But it would also mean providing financial security for his daughter that he couldn't achieve any other way. "I'll need to arrange care for Lily while I'm working for you," Jerome said. "And I'll need to give her some explanation for why my schedule is changing." "We can figure that out," Emma agreed. "The important thing is that you understand what you're agreeing to. This isn't a normal job, and there might be consequences neither of us can anticipate." Jerome looked at Emma's reflection in his rearview mirror, seeing both the vulnerability that had drawn him into her story and the steel that had allowed her to walk away from a life others would envy. She was asking him to trust her with his and Lily's future, just as she was trusting him with hers. "When would this start?" he asked. "Right now," Emma said. "Drive me to the nearest ATM where I can withdraw enough cash to get us started. Then we find somewhere to stay tonight, where no one will think to look for either of us." 6 months later, Jerome sat in the passenger seat of a new Honda Pilot, watching Lily run across the playground of her new school in Evanston. The car still smelled like the dealership, and the monthly payments were manageable thanks to his current job as head of security operations for Harrison Foundation's Chicago office. Emma had kept her word about the $50,000, but more importantly, she had offered him something he hadn't expected, a chance to use his engineering background in a meaningful way. The first few weeks of helping Emma had been exactly as complicated as she'd predicted. They'd stayed in small motels outside the city while she worked with lawyers to protect her assets and gather evidence of David's fraudulent intentions. Jerome had learned more about corporate law and family trusts than he'd ever wanted to know. But he'd also discovered that his analytical skills translated well to investigative work. Emma's instincts about David had proven correct. Within days of the canceled wedding, he'd filed legal papers questioning her mental stability and her fitness to inherit control of the family foundation. But Emma's temporary disappearance had given her legal team time to uncover David's pattern of targeting wealthy women for strategic marriages. 2 previous engagements had ended under suspicious circumstances, both involving women who'd later lost control of significant family assets. The media attention had been intense but ultimately worked in Emma's favor. David's calculated charm couldn't withstand scrutiny from investigative journalists who'd been tipped off about his history. By the time Emma returned to public life, she was viewed as a courageous woman who'd escaped a manipulative relationship rather than an unstable heiress who'd panicked at her own wedding. Jerome's role had evolved naturally, from driver to advisor to trusted friend. Emma had recognized his problem-solving abilities and offered him a position restructuring the foundation's security protocols. The work challenged him intellectually while allowing him to maintain the flexible schedule he needed as a single father. More importantly, it felt meaningful in ways his engineering job never had. Lily had adjusted to their improved circumstances with the same resilience she'd shown during their difficult years. She attended a better school now, had her own bedroom in their two-bedroom apartment, and never had to worry about whether they could afford basic necessities. But she still made friendship bracelets for Jerome's desk and left encouraging notes in his lunch bag. Emma had become an unexpected part of their lives, joining them for dinner occasionally and helping Lily with science projects that reminded Jerome of his own father's patient explanations of how things worked. She'd never replaced Angela in their family dynamic, but she'd brought something new, the proof that people could choose to care for each other without obligation or ulterior motive. The Foundation's work had given both Jerome and Emma a sense of purpose beyond their personal recovery. They'd implemented new oversight procedures that prevented the kind of financial manipulation David had attempted, and they'd expanded programs supporting single parents and families dealing with medical crises. Jerome's own experience with loss and financial hardship had informed policies that made real differences in other people's lives. David Rothschild had eventually pled guilty to fraud charges related to his previous relationships, though he'd served minimal jail time due to his family's influence. Emma had moved past seeking revenge, focusing instead on building something positive from the wreckage of her canceled wedding. She'd learned to trust her own instincts and to value relationships based on genuine connection rather than social expectations. Standing in the parking lot of Lily's school, Jerome reflected on how much had changed since that night outside the Grand Millennium Hotel. He'd helped Emma find her way back to herself, but she'd given him something equally valuable, the reminder that taking calculated risks could lead to outcomes better than anything he might have planned. Lily waved from the monkey bars, and Jerome waved back, knowing that her future was more secure because he'd chosen to listen to a crying bride, instead of simply driving her to whatever destination she'd eventually provided. Sometimes the most important journeys began with no clear destination at all, guided only by the willingness to trust that the next right choice would reveal itself along the way. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.